For this week, we're going to be looking at a virtue approach to ethics, and the material for this lecture comes from Lewis Vaughan, Chapter 7. So as always, make sure that you read the textbook thoroughly before attempting to take the quiz, because what I'm going to be doing in this lecture is just covering sort of the highlights of this chapter to make sure that we understand the major concepts of virtue ethics. So we've already looked at consequentialist moral theories and non-consequentialist moral theories. And when we're looking at those types of moral theories, the major question that we're attempting to answer is, what should I do? What are the moral rules that I should establish so that I can live according to those rules? And that's what consequentialist and non-consequentialist moral theories are primarily concerned with. When it comes to virtue ethics, the question is slightly different. In virtue ethics, we're more concerned with what should I be as a person, or what type of character should I develop as a person? And so if you think about what makes virtue ethics distinct from the consequentialist moral reasoning and non-consequentialist moral reasoning, what makes it distinct is virtue ethics is concerned about forming the type of character, forming you into the type of person that you need to have, the types of virtues that you need to establish to be reliable when it comes to making moral decisions. And so if you can make a good, virtuous person, then you don't need to be focusing on what should I do in this situation versus that situation. So when we were talking about the trolley problem, should I flip the switch? Should I not flip the switch? Well, that's asking, okay, what should I do in that situation? Well, in a virtue approach, if you form the right type of character, the right type of virtues, you will have the wisdom necessary to know when you're in a situation like that what you should do. And so the focus is more on developing the person and not just trying to figure out what are the right types of actions that we should live by. So this approach to ethics goes back to the philosopher Aristotle. And so if you see your picture on your screen, these are two famous Greek philosophers. On the left side of your screen, you have Plato, who is pointing up to the sky, and then you have Aristotle, who's making a gesture forward, almost as if he's hovering down or pointing down at the earth. And that really represents two different philosophies between Plato and Aristotle. Now, Aristotle's a student of Plato, but for Plato, he really argued that if you want to know what is good, right, true, beautiful, then you need to reflect deeply on what he called the realm of the forms. So it's a conceptual world where you have access to the realm of the forms through the exercise of reason. Well, Aristotle was different than that. So he agreed that there was a conceptual way of thinking about the world, but he argued primarily that if you want to know what's right, true, good, beautiful, then you need to look at this world. You need to see examples in the real world that we're living in, and that's how you can discover what is actually true. Well, when it comes to virtue ethics, all modern virtue ethics that we look at today really trace their theoretical roots back to Aristotle. And again, ethics in this system doesn't consist in just following rules, but in striving to become a virtuous person. Now, when you think about what that means, for Aristotle, every living thing, so when we're looking at this world that we're living in, every living thing has an end toward which it naturally aims. And that end represents the greatest good of that thing. And this actually becomes really important for ethics because when you look at humans, the greatest good for humans, or the goal, the telos that we are trying to strive for, is what he called eudaimonia, which just means happiness or flourishing. And that is the highest good that we can be seeking as humans. And so when we think about developing virtues, then we want to serve that end. We want to serve that highest goal of what it means to be human, is the eudaimonia, is to have that human flourishing. And so the virtues that Aristotle comes up with, he distinguishes between intellectual virtues and moral virtues. And the main distinction that you think of when you think of these types of virtues is when it comes to intellectual virtues, these are the virtues or character traits that you need to have that help you become a credible thinker when it comes to intellectual issues. And so there are intellectual virtues like wisdom, prudence, rationality, and we could probably come up with other virtues on our own, such as loving truth versus loving being right. And if you form these intellectual virtues, they will form your character in such a way that if you possess those virtues, you will be a credible thinker. And the same thing is true when it comes to moral virtues. So if you develop the character of being fair, of being benevolent, of being honest, of being loyal, conscientious, courageous, if you form these moral virtues, then when you're in a situation where you have to make a moral decision, you have the character needed to make that decision in the right possible way. Because, again, the focus is on forming your character, forming your virtues, so that you can be a credible moral thinker or a moral decision maker. And so these are the virtues that Aristotle argued that we need to have. And again, we can come up with other moral virtues that make us credible moral thinkers and decision makers. And for Aristotle, when it comes to developing these virtues, he has this idea of what's called the golden mean. So for Aristotle, not all virtue theorists subscribe to this idea, but for Aristotle, coming up with a virtue is usually a balance between two potential extremes. So if we think of the virtue of courage, for example, courage for Aristotle is this medium, this golden mean between being completely reckless versus being a complete coward. So being reckless is not exhibiting the virtue of courage. It would be just being reckless. That is a vice for Aristotle. And on the other hand, being a coward would also not be a virtue, it would be a vice for Aristotle. Courage is this golden mean between those two extremes. And so when it comes to any of the virtues, really it's this golden mean between two extremes. Another important concept for Aristotle is this idea of the end. Um, Aristotle's approach to ethics is sometimes called a teleological approach to ethics. So every natural thing has its end that it's working to, or its goal, or its purpose. And to understand this idea, I've gotten a lot of help from the philosopher Michael Sandel. So he's an ethicist at Harvard University. And when he talks about Aristotle's approach to ethics, he uses the example of distributing flutes. So let's suppose that we had a limited amount of flutes in the world. And maybe an easy way to think about this is, let's just say we have 3 flutes and the world just consists of 100 people. So if you have 3 flutes, but there's 100 people, what is the best way, the most ethical way of distributing flutes? Well, we've already looked at a utilitarian approach to ethics, and a utilitarian answer might be something like this. We want to distribute flutes in such a way that makes the most amount of people happy. Well, maybe what will make the most amount of people happy is hearing good music, and so if that's what makes the most amount of people happy, then we want to give the 3 flutes that we have to the best flute players so that the most amount of people will be happy. Well, that might be a utilitarian answer to answer this question. We might be able to come up with a libertarian answer. So maybe it's something like whoever can purchase the flute in the free market at the price that consenting adults agree to. That might be the way that you distribute flutes, is just have a free market. Let the market decide who gets the flutes. And then we haven't talked about an egalitarian approach to ethics yet, but this would promote some sort of principle of fairness, where maybe you want to have everyone have equal access to the flute, and so everyone gets 10 minutes with the flute, so that not just one person has the flute. And there's a variety of ways that we could answer this question, looking at utilitarianism, libertarianism, and egalitarianism. Well, Aristotle's answer is different than all of this. So when it comes to, say, the ethics of distributing flute, Aristotle would ask a further question: what is the purpose of a flute? And he would argue that before you can answer the question, how should we distribute flutes, we have to talk about the end, the purpose, the goal of what a thing is made for. And so if the answer to that question is the goal of a flute is to make beautiful music, then Aristotle would say, then we want to give the flutes to the best flute players. Not because it will make the most amount of people happy, but because that's what a flute is for. It's for making beautiful music. Now, if we think about this analogy and we compare it to all of ethics in Aristotle's thinking, um, the purpose for humans, as I've already mentioned, is eudaimonia, this idea of human flourishing. But this actually relates to everything when it comes to families. So the goal within each family unit for Aristotle would be to create a virtuous family, so that that family will flourish. And the reason why there are families is so that you can have virtuous communities, so that the community will flourish, so that you can have virtuous cities and virtuous countries, so that countries would experience human flourishing or human happiness. And so everything in Aristotle's ethics is focused on the end goal. What are the purpose of these services that we're providing, these institutions that we're providing, the people who have different jobs within a society? What are the purpose of all of these different things? And when we define those purposes, that helps us determine what just distribution is all about, and that helps us determine how we're supposed to live within society. It also helps us determine what types of virtues we want to establish within families, societies, cities, etc. And the ultimate goal of all of that, so the ultimate end, is this idea of human flourishing. So those are just the basic ideas of a virtue approach to ethics. Again, make sure that you read the chapter carefully so that you're prepared for the quiz this week.